So now you have the state script made and you have the ability to make scripts. And now we need a way to update the text that is inside your scene as you play through the game. So what the best way we can do this is we can use something called an array. Arrays are a type of code that contain like a kind of a list of information of different types. So if you remember from initially at the beginning of the year, whenever you went through the Unity C# basics, there was a page on arrays, which if you click on it will load this page. And an array stores multiple elements of the same type. So it will look very familiar because it is very much like a variable. It's just a kind of specific type of variable. It is, so in this example, we've got int, which is, as you know, the variable name for an integer. And it's got these square brackets, which basically tells the Unity that we are making an array that will contain integers. So that's what square brackets mean. We've got the name, odd numbers, and then we have inside curly braces the information, the data that is contained inside of this array. So odd numbers 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. So same naming conventions as a variable. The first word is lowercase, the following words are uppercase. It's called camel case in case you're interested. When you call an array value, you always count up from 0. So if I want the number 5 from up here, I would call, whenever I call my array, I would say I want the piece of information that's in spot 2, because it would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, because you always count up from 0 whenever you're dealing with arrays. And then you use an array to contain information that you need to reference easily, especially if you need to reference several different parts of the same set of information. That's a good way to keep all of that put together. So say you could also have an array that contained the days of the week. So instead of type int, it would be of type string, because that's the variable type for whenever we're containing words. Then we'd have our square brackets, and then we could call it lowercase days, capital of the week. And then inside of this, we'd have in quotation marks with commas between each of the days of the week. And then say we wanted, if we started on Sunday, say we wanted Tuesday, so it would be Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. So again, we'd call for the string that's in the position of 2, because 0, 1, 2. It might seem a little bit confusing, but you'll get used to it. Arrays are very useful, and we will use them quite a bit. So back in our Unity over here, this is what we are at right now, and I want you to open up your state script, and we are going to create an array here in this script that's going to be used for containing what the next possible states could be. So right now we're starting in starting state, right? So whenever we load the game, it automatically inserts the text from starting state into the game. So if I hit play, you get starting state. So what I want is to store within this information right here, I want to be able to tell it what states I could possibly go to next. So in here, I need to be able to edit it from the inspector. So if you guessed it, we need to serialize the field. And we are going to make an array. This array will be of type state because I'm making a list that contains different states. So I'm going to call it state, and then I need square brackets. It automatically inserts my second square bracket for me. And then let's call it the next states, because we need to know what's coming up next and make sure we spell it right. And semicolon. Okay, so whenever I have this field here that says there's a serialized field, it is of type state, and it is, I need to get my next states right here. I'm also going to need a public method, because I want to be able to acquire these states from my adventure game code. So public state, and we know that that's an array. We're going to call this method get next states, and because it's a method, it has those. And because we put information in here, we need to return something. Remember, whenever we put a return of string, we had to return our story text. In this case, we need to return our next states. So we've made a serialized field in the inspector, and what we're going to do with it is whenever we summon that, it will give us a list of what states exist in our game. So first of all, I probably need to make some more states, right? So I'm going to go ahead and create a new state, and I think I called my first room something like A1. I'm not sure. Let me double check that. I can always rename it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these names that I gave these rooms and use that as my code name so that I can keep my stuff organized really well. So I called it A.1. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this because I know I'm going to need it in a second. A.1. Okay. And then I'm going to throw that text in there so I know it exists. And also you might note there is this array list right here in my state, and there was one right here in starting state. Perfect, that's what I want. In my story states folder, I'm going to make another state. I'm going to call it A.2, and I'm going to grab the text that's in here. Okay. Perfect. So now I have this, and I can do this really neat thing. So in my serialized field, this size is the number of elements that are in my array. So I have, at the end of this, I could press 1 to check out the window and press 2 to open the door. So I need space for 2 elements. So if I type 2, now I have 2 things of type state that I can insert into these 2 slots. And I could make it 10, I could make it 1, I can make it whatever I need, but right now I know I need 2 because my player has 2 different rooms that they could go to. So I can do this one of 2 ways, just like always whenever you're dragging things over to the inspector. You could drag them over, or you could use the selector. So say I wanted to use this, I could click A1, and I want to click this one. I'm going to make this one A2. I could just as easily have grabbed this and dragged it over like so. The only trick is, sometimes whenever you're clicking and dragging, if you'll click on this, but you accidentally let off, and then all of a sudden now you have to go back over here. You can't drag it over anymore. A trick that you can use to avoid having to do that is if you come up here to the top of your inspector, and it's possible you'll do this on accident someday, so it's good to know, you can freeze it with this little lock. So now if I click on A1, it still stays showing me the starting state. So I can drag things over without having to worry about accidentally clicking on them, which is perfect. That's a good way to do it that way, especially if you have a bunch of stuff that's going to pop up in your selector and you don't want to have to deal with that. And then you have to unlock it, and then it will go to show you whatever one you have selected. So in my A2 room, I had the option to go look out the window, which according to my flowchart cycles back to A1, which is great. So I'm going to make that an element of size 1, or an array of size 1, because there's only one option that the player could actually select, and I'm going to take them back to A1. And then A1, they have more options, but for right now I'm actually going to change this to 1, and I'm just going to have it starting state so that I can just kind of cycle back around. I'm not going to make the rest of the states right now while you're watching, because that seems like a lot of extra work that you don't need to watch me do. You're going to be doing plenty of it yourself. So now I have it so that if I have these states storing this information of what state is coming up next. Now I need to make it so that my game knows what to do whenever it's summoned to do those things. So in our scripts, we need to be looking at our adventure game script. So in our adventure game script, what we need to do is access those that state array, and then from that, tell our game how to react, essentially. So we're going to make a new method. We're going to call it manage state. So I'm just going to call it void manage state. And of course, open and closed. And curly brackets. Now, that is not ever going to go in action, right? It's not anywhere in any of the rest of this. It's just a method that's floating by itself. So we need to call it. Now, here's where I need to decide. Do I need it to call once whenever the game loads, or do I need it to be called repeatedly? Well, I know that as the person is playing the game, they will be pressing buttons throughout. So therefore, I need it to be called in the update method, because it will be run every frame to check and see if anything happened that needs to react. So I'm going to call it in update, manage state, like so. And now it will summon this information right here. So up here, remember, this is how we got the text from our state with our public method, because remember, we made these public so that we could get them from anywhere else. So this is a public method that it is calling. It's saying the text component.text, which is attached to adventure game, will now equal what's on state, and is called a method getStateStory. So right down here, we need to also summon something from state, and that thing we need to summon is the getNextStates, because we need to know on those states what states have been added to it manually through the editor, and then what to do from there. So we're making a variable called nextStates, and we're equaling that to state.getNextStates, like so. So on state, which we've already dealt with before, so whenever I hover over this, you see we declared state, we called it state. And then on that piece of code, we are looking for getNextStates, which over here, getNextStates returns the next states, and as you know, in the inspector has all of that information. So we've accessed the information. Now we need to know what we need to do with that information. So step 1 is going to look very familiar, because we're going to use an if statement, and we are going to say if the player pushes a button, we are going to set our state equal to the next state that was selected. So this piece of code you probably already know. If you don't, I'll repeat it out loud. But if you do know the code for if player pushes a button, do this, then go ahead and type it in before I do. Take a guess at it. That would be great. It gives you some good practice. But if not, it is input.getKeyDown. So we need to know when they press the key. And then we need, as our little thing is prompting us, a key code. So we are going to say key code dot, and then this big old list right here has all the key codes that we could possibly use. Now, I know, just off the top of my head, that alpha 1 actually means the keypad 1, which is fine. That's what we want. So the 1 key, and then open and close curly brackets. And like I said before, we need to set our state, because we are changing what state is being run. And we're going to set it to nextStates. And here is where that array is going to come super in handy. So we need to set it to nextStates and then whichever button was pushed. So if we push button 1, so let me look at starting state here. This is a good example. If I have a player on this screen push button 1, they'll go to A1. To do that, it specifically says here that is element 0. It is element 0 in the array. So I don't put 1 here, I put 0. Again, I know it's tricky. It may not line up in your head perfectly, but I promise with enough practice that will make sense. So they're setting their state equal to next state. Now, at most, I'm going to say my story has 3 different options that the player can do. So, oops, hit the wrong button. So I'm actually just going to copy this code and paste it, which generally I don't recommend. But in this case, it's pretty simple code, and I only have to change a couple of things. And I will have all of my states figured out. So if they push 3, they'll go to element number 2. So yeah, now I have 3 different things that if the player pushes these different things, then we'll go there. Actually, these are all successive else statements, or if statements. I actually don't want that. Else if, because if they push 1 and 2 at the same time, I don't want it to react independently. I want if, else if, so that they don't do those things on accident. Now, this is great. Here's everything we did just in review. We set up a variable that was called next states, which you can see used repeatedly, and that is referencing the array we created on the state called get next states that we fill in the inspector. And then if you push 1, it will get the next state that's in element 0. 2 will get you the state in element 1. And if you press 3, it'll get you the state that's in element 2. So it's almost a tongue twister because I almost said the wrong number. So right now, that doesn't do anything, right? That won't actually update any of the text because it'll just get that information. It's not going to actually do anything on the screen. So remember, back at the beginning, whenever we set our starting state and we got the state story, we use this piece of code right here. So text component.text equals state.getStateStory. So that does that at start, and that's perfect because it tells us the starting state. But once it gets that, we need on update for it to do the same thing. We need it to say if they press 0, then they go, or if they press 1, they go to room 1, and so on and so forth. Again, it's kind of a tongue twister. I almost say the wrong one every time. Okay, so if I hit play after it compiles, I get room 1. And if I press 1, I move slowly, swaying as the blood rushes in your ears. Moving to the window, you look out and see nothing but crashing waves and a partially hidden moon. Sitting on the windowsill is a screwdriver. I actually don't have the room set up for take the screwdriver, but it takes me back to the room 1, so that'll work fine. But see, now I have a cycle of it updates. Whenever I'm getting an error here. This is something you will run into too. It says array index is out of range. That is because it is looking, when I was spamming buttons right here, it said when you press this button, go to a room that doesn't exist. And that's okay. Don't worry about it. We will deal with that at a later date. But for right now, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go through and add new states for each one of your rooms and hook it all up so that everything in here will flow through your story. So you should have, probably upwards of 10, 15 different states right here that cycle smoothly back and forth between each other. And basically you have the entire game engine essentially done. It's really just all about getting the states put in and making sure that they all go to each other. So have fun getting that one done, and I will see you whenever you get it all finished. Okay, so I'm going to teach you how to fix the issue we had before and also give you a little bit of a bonus points opportunity. So what I want you to do is once you are done with making sure your game works and you've play tested it and everything, and it loops through all of your states. So as you can see, I went through and added in a bunch of story states to mine. You will have more than this. I just made a very rudimentary game. But you have finished with all that, your bonus point opportunity is to fancy up how your game looks a little bit. So I've added a background onto mine, and I've added some of my fancy text to my story text, and I've made the color block behind here slightly transparent so you can see my spooky texture room back here. I did just steal this from the internet, which is not, necessarily a great thing, but at this point, this game is only for demo purposes, so I'm good with that being something just off the internet randomly. And so, yeah, bonus points. I will give you bonus points if you fancy up your game and make it more than just plain colors, and have add in a background component and do some other interesting things. Even if you add the background component, you could also maybe consider adding like maybe a character picture here, or some kind of extra panel, or maybe a shape behind your logo. I don't know. That's up to you. But I do want you to take this and make it your own. Make it have a fancy look to it. Okay. So as you know, right now we're getting this error where whenever we play our game, if I push a button that is not an option, this happens. So I can't do this. And actually, I've already noticed a problem with my story text. I don't know if you noticed, but you'll have to make sure your text has numbers programmed into it. Mine apparently does not, so I'm going to have to add in a different text. So I fixed one bug, and I'm going to fix one bug, and I also have found another new bug that I have to fix. So I will do that off screen, find a new text that I like for my game. But I'm not going to worry about that for now. That's the reason playtesting is important, though. Okay, so to fix that error where it says the array index is out of range, we need to come into our adventure game .cs, and this is what's causing it. It's basically saying if you push 3 and there is no option for 3, and it looks for something that's there, it's throwing an error that will break your game that says, hey, this doesn't exist. It will freeze. It will make it so your game doesn't go any further because it has encountered something it cannot reconcile in any way. So what we need to do instead of this is we are going to create what is called a for loop. A for loop is basically a type of code that will kind of repeat through itself, and check repeatedly through the loop. And in this instance, it will work because we are going to use it to create or find the length of our next states, however many states there could be, and then use that to determine what state we go to, instead of all of these if and else if statements. So I'm going to comment out all of this, which I believe is /star. And then I still need this last little bit, so */. Oop, that's an 8. */. That just makes it so that this code, much like these 2 /, doesn't exist temporarily, just so I can deal with that later. And we're going to write our for loop. So I'm going to type all this out, and you can follow along and type it with me, and I'll explain what it means at the end, because it's easier if you see it in action. So for is how we start a for loop. We are declaring an integer, and we are calling it index, and we're going to go ahead and set it to 0, because generally best practice is to go ahead and set your variables when you create them. And then index is less than next states dot length. Oops, that's not how you spell length. There we go. And then index ++. And because this is a for loop, we need to open and close curly brackets to make this complete. And let's talk about this a little bit. Okay. So in my for loop, I am declaring a local variable called index. I set it to 0. If the index is less than the number of next states length, so the next states dot length means the length of the array. So if I were to come over here and look at one of my states, so the length of this array is 2. So if 0 is less than 2, it will take that information and pass it in. Then I will add 1 to the index. So if next state's length is 2, it will add 1 number to the index. So why this is good is if I'm going to take this if statement right here, I'm going to put it right here. So whenever it runs this information, it's going to look and it's going to say, for right now, our index is 0. It's going to look at the length that I have here, and it's going to say, hey, it's greater than 0. We'll add 1 to it. So if I push 1, it will do this information. But I don't necessarily want it to do just 1. I want it to do alpha 1 plus index, which means it will take this number, add it to 1, and it will give me the information that I need for which room I'm going to be in. And then this, instead of a specific hard-coded magic number, it's going to be index. And it's kind of complex and kind of weird, but it should give us exactly what we need. And before we delete this extra code, let's go in and double check. So if I were to hit 2, I go to room 2, go to room 1. If I hit 3, nothing happens, and I get no errors. Perfect. So once I go fix my other stuff, so I don't need any of this information anymore, we actually ended up, through finding a bug, writing our code in a much simpler way that requires much less typing. So that's always a good thing. Making your code more efficient is definitely ideal. So now that you've got this all fixed up, your game doesn't have any game-breaking bugs, you should take on this challenge. Make your game have fancy looks to it. Try to put a background on there. You can do it several ways, I'll tell you. There is not one perfect right answer. You can do it a couple of different ways. Just know that you will need to add it to, your hint is that you will have to add it to your canvas, and make sure that you double check that your settings on your background will stretch or shrink based on the way that you have the anchor point set up. And double check that if you change your story text, so like I did, I changed my story text in here to this other font, but you note that the story text didn't have numbers attached to it, right? So I'm going to, for now, I'll put it back at Arial because I know that has the numbers that I need. Let me double check. Yep, everything's back where it's supposed to be. And I'm going to have to go find a font that actually has the letter or numbers imported so I can actually use that. So you have your challenge, you have your game pretty much done. Once everything is all set, you've play tested it, you've had some other people play test it, go ahead and go back through the simmer.io uploading process, log in with your regular account like you did before, get that embed code, email that code to me, and I will put it up on the website. You can see, if you have not looked yet, if you go to, you see where I found my picture. That's not what I want. Okay, if you come to the knoxgamedesign.weebly.com and you come over to completed game projects, you can find your initials on here, and that will be the game that you made the first time. So if you click on it, it should take you to a page that will load your simmer.io game. You hit play, it'll load it, and you'll be able to play through your game, which is perfect. So I will just start adding your games to that page, and you will be able to go through all the games that you've made throughout the year. And it will also kind of function as a little bit of a digital portfolio for you until you set up your own. So do the challenge. Your game needs to be uploaded at the end, and then you need to email the embed code to me, and you will be all set and ready to go on to our next game, which we will be learning a lot more about physics and making sprites and making our game look much more gamey than the games we have in that we've made so far. Because the games we've made so far feel very old school, and we're going to kind of move forward to a more modern sort of style, which I'm sure you're all very excited about. So we will head on to that very, very soon.